Hello and welcome. I am so glad that you have joined me here today. Today we are looking at the second half of Nehemiah chapter 2. So grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm get out to more people. So previously in chapter 2 we looked how Nehemiah had looked very sad in the presence of the king because he was grieving about the state of Jerusalem. The king Artaxerxes, he asked him, "Why are you so sad?" And Nehemiah explained that it was because his homeland had been is just a pile of rubble, and he requested from the king some resources and some time off to go repair. And so then the king had sent him to go. So we are up to, in chapter 2, we are up to verse 10. So when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officials heard about this, they were very much disturbed that somebody had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So now Nehemiah had decided to go. He decided to go and repair the walls of Jerusalem. He now receives an attack. So two men in particular are mentioned here. We've got Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. And later on we see a third opponent. We see Gershom the Arab, who appears later on in verse 19. So Sanballat and Tobiah were deeply disturbed that Nehemiah had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel, and they came to oppose the work of Nehemiah. So Sanballat the Horonite, he is Sanballat the First, was a Sumerian leader and an official in the Persian Empire, who obviously lived in the late 5th century BC, because it's the same time period that we are in for Nehemiah. And so he's a contemporary, obviously, to Nehemiah. Sanballat was connected by marriage to some of the priestly families, and we'll see this is an important point when we look at Nehemiah chapter 13. And so we might have supposed that he would have supported Nehemiah's work, but he didn't. Opposition is always difficult when it comes from within family and those that are close to you, and it's mixed with sort of a bit of a pain of betrayal as well. Now, interestingly, we have some archaeological evidence of Sanballat. In the Elephantine Papyrus, number 30, toward the end of the papyrus, it reads, "Moreover, all these things in the letter we sent in the name of Delilah and Salimana, sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria." So it's really interesting that we've got some archaeological facts, evidence that support the fact that he was a real man at that time. The second guy, Tobiah the Ammonite. Tobiah is a Jewish name. He was a man of influence, being associated with the high priest's family as well. And he's getting help from the priest. We see that in Nehemiah 13 verse 4. So we'll cover that when we cover that chapter. The name Tobiah was a prominent name amongst priestly families for generations to come. The name Tobiah itself means Yahweh is good. And so it's a strange name for a man to have when he is actually an opponent to the work of the Lord. The Ammonites were also descendants of Lot. Tobiah was the governor of Ammon, so he's a high-ranking official appointed by the Persians and the Transjordan Amorites when Nehemiah was rebuilding Jerusalem after returning from Babylon. Tobiah, he's offended, and so he builds this temple. He builds a royal palace, actually, which was located in the Transjordan in the native homeland of the Ammonites. And this temple can still be seen today. It's an amazing full-size rocked carvings of lions all around the temple. So again, this supports that Tobiah was a real living person at the time of Nehemiah. Now, the third guy we haven't actually seen in chapter 2 yet. We'll see him a little bit later, but we'll cover him now. Gershom the Arab. He's the only Arab mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And he was an ally of Sanballat and Tobiah and an adversary of Nehemiah. So there is extra biblical evidence of him as well, Gershom the Arab. So in the 1950s, the Brooklyn Museum acquired 4 silver libation bowls, and they were said to have been found in the Middle East at a site, an ancient shrine located near the Nile Delta in northern Egypt. This bowl's inscriptions refer to I can't pronounce this, Kainu, the king of Kedar, and the position was held by Gershom the Arab. And the name Gershom the Arab appears on this ceremonial bowl. And so the size of this libation bowl, just for interest's sake, it's perfectly designed to fit inside your hand. And the middle finger holds sort of the central part of the bowl, so you can hold it quite firmly to be able to tip your drink offering. It's a beautiful design. You can look it up yourself on Google. So the next verse, we see that Nehemiah how he approaches this opposition, and how he simply just continues with the plan to restore Jerusalem. Some people fear never stepping out for the Lord because they know the opposition will come, and they somehow think that their life will be better off or easier just to sort of stay in their low, mediocre state before God. But what a deception. Tough times are going to come anyway, but they are going to come when we're stepping out also in faith with the Lord. But we will be far more able to be equipped to deal with them, because God will provide us everything we need when he calls us to his holy purposes. So Nehemiah, he comes to Jerusalem. He's going to inspect the walls of Jerusalem in verses 11 to 20. So he decides to go to Jerusalem to personally oversee the rebuilding of the city's walls, because it had a deep burden for these people and their physical state and their spiritual state. And he saw the need for security and the prosperity of the city, and he understood that God called him to lead this vital task, even though there was formidable opposition. His personal involvement was critical in motivating the people, directing the work, and seeing the project through to completion, which involved overcoming significant challenges and opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah, and Gershom. Verse 11, he says, I went to Jerusalem after staying there 3 days. I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put on my heart to do for Jerusalem, and there were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. So many people have the heart, they're touched by God, like Nehemiah's heart, and they may also have the heart for prayer and for wisdom and the vision and the plan and the faith that Nehemiah had, but they stop short of actually going out and doing what needs to be done to reach the goal, to become a final reality. And sometimes we substitute talking about something for actually doing it. And this is one thing that stands out with other believers, and talking about doing something like evangelism and praying about it and planning about it and talking about it. And it's another thing to actually go out and do it. And God is in the doing of things, not just in the planning of things. So the spiritual enemies don't mind us planning and praying and talking about mission work, as long as that is all we do. If all we do is plan and pray and talk about it, then the devil is quite happy. But God's people need to start doing. And that is when the enemy starts to take notice. And that's where the objection from the enemy will come. So after much prayer, Nehemiah went. So in verse 9, we see the words, so I went. Verse 11, we see, I went to Jerusalem. And it's another example of Nehemiah's godly leadership. He actually went. He actually did it. He travelled the 1,200 kilometres from Persia in Susa to Jerusalem, where the building work was going to happen. And this would have taken about 4 to 5 months to travel that distance. And so perhaps the reason for there not being an account for the first 3 days in Jerusalem was because he was just resting from that long trip. So he did nothing for 3 days when he first arrived in Jerusalem. Verse 12, he says, I set out during the night. Verse 13, it says, by night I went through the valley. So Nehemiah, he went out at night to conduct a discreet and strategic inspection of the damage of the walls of Jerusalem. So travelling under the cover of darkness with only a few of the trusted men, Nehemiah avoided drawing attention to his plans and potential adversaries who would have tried to obstruct the goal of rebuilding the ancient walls. And this approach allowed him to access the full extent of the damage and formulate a well thought out plan before making his intentions known to the public. Verse 13, by night I went through the gate, the valley gate, toward the jackal well, and to the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. And when I moved toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the walls, and finally I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. So Nehemiah is examining the walls of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah wasn't just sightseeing, instead he was carefully studying the broken down walls and the burnt gates. Nehemiah needed to really investigate for himself how bad the state of the walls were. So this word examining, some versions might say viewed or inspected, it's a Hebrew word which is like a medical term. It's also used for probing a wound to see the extent of the damage. So its intention, it's really sort of intentional, concentrated inspections. That's what Nehemiah's do. He's really having a really good look at the state of the walls. So the walls of Jerusalem were at this time just heaps of rubble and the gates were burnt down. So we're just going to look at, well, what is the significance of the city's walls and the city's gates? So simply put, the city's walls are for security and the city's gates are for society. So the city walls, so up until modern times, city walls have always provided protection against enemies. An attacking enemy would find it hard and difficult to invade a well-walled city. With a sturdy city wall, it would basically close up the city at night, and so that the people could sleep safely in that city. And without it, it meant that the whole city was open to attack. Jerusalem wasn't just threatened by major armies, it would have also been threatened just by small roving rogues of bandits. Once rebuilt, such a wall would be the strength of the city. They would build a wall it would be a protection, and it would also help in battle. So the walls of Jerusalem, they included features such as battlements and loopholes. There was some arrow loops, which is sort of a narrow vertical slit in the wall through which the army could fire arrows to the invading army. The walls also included some machicolations. So a machicholation, they are a very nasty design to a city's wall. So this would be the most horrifying and disturbing aspect of any ancient wall, including the walls in Jerusalem. So it's like a little porch in the wall, and it has an opening underneath that porch. So this has been where hot oil and boiling water or stones could be poured and dropped through the hole in the porch onto invading enemy troops. And so the use of animal fat or oil, which is very dangerous for the defenders to use because it reaches a boiling point of 400 degrees before the oil starts to burn. And so Josephus, just for a point of interest, he records this technique being used in Roman times, and he records some really horrific results of how these machicolations were used. So he says the Romans, so the Romans are using these things as well, and this is how they were used. The Romans began already to get up upon the wall, and then did Josephus take... this is worded very trickily because it's a translation, so bear with me while I read through this. Then did Josephus take necessity of his counselor in the utmost distress and give him orders to pour scalding oil upon those shields that protected them. And this is the Jews, they brought, being a great quantity also, and poured on all sides upon the Romans. And they threw down their vessels as if they still hissing from the heat of the fire. This so burnt the Romans that they dispersed the united band, and now tumbled down from the wall in horrid pains, for the oil did easily run down the whole body from the head to the foot under the armour, and fed upon their flesh like flames itself. It's a horrifying account of what hot oil does to enemies. And oil, it's so more viscous than water. It really gets deep under all their clothing and under the armour, and it burnt at 400 degrees. It was a horror of war. It's a horrifying defensive military technique. It's enough to give you nightmares. Now, the city gates were not only entry points into the city, but also centres of government and commerce. So town leaders would meet at certain gates, and they would judge and try cases. And the merchants would do their business there. We can see that in Proverbs 31 verse 23, and we can see this in 2 Samuel 19 verse 8. And this is where really society functioned. And the gates were trade centres of Jerusalem. And with the gates burnt, it meant that Jerusalem really wasn't a city anymore. The real heartbeat of the city was gone. Verse 16, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or the officials or any others who would be doing the work. So in verse 16, he says he hasn't shared this news with anyone. He hasn't told anyone what God has put on his heart for Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah didn't tell anybody about the plan to rebuild because he needed to first assess the situation in secret and prevent his enemies from discovering his intentions and sabotaging the project. He performed a discreet night inspection of the city walls and only revealed his plans to the people and to the local officials once he had a clear understanding of what the task was. We can be reminded of this in Proverbs 21 verse 5. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. Verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble that we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God was on me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began the good work. So Nehemiah then explained his vision for rebuilding the walls to the leaders of the city of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah could now speak with personal experience. No doubt the greatest factor in his appeal to the people was his remarkable testimony of the way that God had controlled the matters up until this point. Nehemiah, he sold his vision by first communicating the problem, so the ruined walls and the disgrace and the lack of security, and then presenting them with a solution that was rooted in faith and divine assurance. He motivated the people by reminding them that God was with them, which inspired a collective responsibility and a belief and a firm hope in success despite all the challenges. So Nehemiah, he didn't offer rewards or incentives for those to get the job done. Those were all external motivations and aren't really God's highest calling. External motivations like manipulation and guilt and pressure and carnal rewards can't work, they can work for a while, but they will never be a part of God's vision for getting things done. So Nehemiah relied on the Lord and for the leaders to create a true inward motivation. So Nehemiah's wise approach gives us a really good example to follow. So wisely, Nehemiah invited them to notice the situation. He says, look, see the trouble that we're in. He wisely owned the problem, and it was his also. He said, look at the trouble that we are in. So wisely, Nehemiah asked them to partner with him in the project. He said, let us start rebuilding. Nehemiah pointed to them to the result of the completed the wall. So he's giving them vision. He says, we will no longer be in disgrace. Nehemiah wisely encouraged them in the Lord. So he says, I told them about the gracious hand of God that was on me. And lastly, Nehemiah wisely gave them confidence by telling them what God had already done. He gave his testimony of how God had his hand on this project. He says, and then I told them what the king had said to me. So verse 18, he claims that the gracious hand of God was on me. And how can we tell if the gracious hand of God is on another person's ministry? And we can tell that God's hand is upon another person's ministry if we see divine enablement. We see that God provides maybe some unusual favour or some protection or success despite the natural challenges. So it could look like the accomplishment was an impossible task. That's an indicator that maybe God's hand was on it. Maybe things are accelerated and progressed quickly. It's happening faster than they should. Maybe it's overcoming opposition that really should have prevented that project from happening. Or maybe whether it's there's willing and generous participation from others who would otherwise have refused to be involved. So just as Nehemiah had experienced these things in the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. We can see just in our own walks of life indicators of where God's hand is supporting ministries. In verse 18 he says, I replied, let us start building. And so they began the good work. And so this response of the leaders of Jerusalem was really inspired by a heart for God. They said, yes, Nehemiah, we're with you. And this is more remarkable considering the ways that they might have responded and ways we might respond when there's a challenge into partnering in the work of God. They may have denied the need of the work. They may have said, we've gotten along so well. It's been okay. It's been 100 years from now. We've survived without these walls. We don't really need to get them done. They may have seen that the project was too much work. So they could have said something like, I don't have time to help you right now, Nehemiah. They may have seen the project as just not even their responsibility. Oh, well, Nehemiah, this is fine work, but I hope it goes well for you, but I don't think I can help you right now. Or they might have seen that the opposition was too strong. They could have said something like, oh, Nehemiah, why even start? We've tried before and our enemies have stopped us. There's just no point trying again. But yet God had moved their hearts and they were willing to participate in the Lord's work because of the way Nehemiah had encouraged them to be involved in this project, because the Lord's hand was on them. Verse 19, but then Sanballat and Tobiah, the Ammonite, the officials, and Gershom the Arab heard about this, and they mocked and they ridiculed us. What is this that you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? So in verse 19, Nehemiah again receives opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah, and now Gershom the Arab. Sanballat and Tobiah, they have used scorn in their attack. They wanted Nehemiah to feel mocked and stupid and foolish. The NIV says they mocked and ridiculed us. The NET says they derived us and expressed contempt, or derided us. They derided us and expressed contempt. The King James Version says they laughed at us to scorn and despised us. The ESV says they jeered us and they despised us. So it really shows their spite and how much they despise them. And so scorn is intended really to humiliate and to degrade by making you feel sort of inferior and inadequate. So that's what their strategy was. They also said, what is this that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? So Nehemiah's enemies accused Nehemiah of rebelling against the king. So Sanballat and Tobiah had a low view of God's authority, and their questions show that they figured that the king of Persia, so King Artaxerxes, was the highest authority in the land. They were completely ignorant. They didn't know that what they were really speaking about. The King of Kings had given permission and they didn't even know it. And the king, so capital King, was actually partnering in the work. So God himself, King of Israel, was giving authority for this project. But they also, even if they also had the support of King Artaxerxes anyway. So Nehemiah wasn't rebelling against the king. He was doing this project with the support of the king. Verse 20, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success, and we, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim, historic right to it. So in response to the opposition of Nehemiah basically just ignored their scorn. His bold, straightforward words, he showed that he had not been put in a defensive position by their mocking and scornful attack. When faced with the choice of pleasing man or pleasing God, Nehemiah knew exactly what to do. He said, let them mock, basically, and we will still serve the Lord. Nehemiah didn't give like a point-by-point reply, detailed reply. He did not need to show a document, that document that he'd got from the king. He didn't show them that. If he did, Sanballat and Tobiah could have come up with just another objection. And Nehemiah knew their hearts really were to refuse to be convicted that this was God's project. Instead, Nehemiah just said, the God of heaven will give us success. So Nehemiah proclaimed and reasserted his confidence in God. basically he's saying, it doesn't matter if you're against me, God's work will proceed and it will succeed. And so there is a touch of holy boldness in Nehemiah's response. Verse 20, he says, we, his servants, will start rebuilding. So Nehemiah proclaimed who he was. He was a servant of God, and he proclaims what he will do, and he will rebuild the walls. Verse 20, second part of verse 20 says, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So Nehemiah proclaimed the truth about his enemies. Nehemiah sized the two up, or the three up, and he knew that they were not for him or for Jerusalem or for God in any way. And though they may have claimed to be, and it was as if Nehemiah said, you don't belong here. God's doing a great work here, and you don't want to be a part of it. Your heart is not in this, and you have no right to be here. And you can say this of your spiritual enemies. You have no heritage or right to be here. I belong to Christ. You don't belong here. You may as well move on because I'm not going anywhere. And so, however, this opposition didn't immediately go away. And we often wish that if we did everything right, as Nehemiah did, that we wish that opposition would just go away. But it didn't, and it doesn't. These men opposed the work all the way up until it was finished, and they were unable and unsuccessful at stopping the rebuilding of the walls. God's work still got done, and Nehemiah's enemies were proved in the end to be completely wrong. So that's all I have for you for the whole of chapter 2. Thank you for bearing with me over 2 sessions that we covered this in. It's been a pleasure spending time with you, and I look forward to our next session when we cover Nehemiah chapter 3. Bye.